Let's go. Releasing in 1976, the game Breakout is a variation on the gameplay of Pong. The game comes from the same studio that developed Pong, that being Atari. However, the game is also notable for it being worked on by the eventual founders of Apple, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Both of them would work on this game and then later go on to actually be founders of the company Apple. However, the game is, again, like I said, a variation of Pong. The game features a small rectangular paddle that then is able to move left to right on the field and hit a small square that is effectively acting in the place of a ball to break and destroy a series of blocks. The object of the game is to see how many of these blocks you can break and ultimately try to break all the blocks so that you can break out. The game itself is actually very fun, and as I said, it seems to be essentially a single-player variant on the gameplay of Pong. However, instead of attempting to replicate table tennis, you're trying to break as many of these blocks as you can with this ball, with it increasing in speed depending on how the ball would actually bounce off of the paddle and the trajectory in which it would go, and it would basically be determining on which blocks it would break and where it would bounce and how it would bounce back, and being able to bounce off of the walls as well in the field. It's actually a very fun game, and actually one that holds up fairly well. And personally, I know while I may not necessarily have had a ton of experience with specifically this version of Breakout, there are other types of Breakout style games that I have definitely played in the past. For instance, my first cell phone had a game that was called Block Breaker, and effectively it was a clone of Breakout, just with other little enhancements like power-ups and different things that would spawn different balls that would affect the game and make it a little bit more fast-paced and more challenging. Another difference is actually the size of the actual paddle that the player is controlling. In this particular version of Breakout, or rather the original version of Breakout, featured in the Atari 50th Celebration Collection, it features a relatively small paddle, especially compared to many of the Breakout clones that I've played in the past. This actually makes the game a little bit more challenging, and it was actually one of the things that really challenged me when trying to actually play the game for this video, in the sense that while the game and the concept of the game are not necessarily challenging, the ability to actually figure out where the paddle was going to be and how close it was going to be within the ability of it being able to hit the ball back up to break more blocks was actually kind of difficult, as the smaller size of the paddle made it a lot more difficult to quickly get to wherever the ball was going to be heading. The other thing with this that really stood out to me is that the game, while being very simple, also provided a fair amount of challenge. It's not a particularly difficult game, similarly with Pong, but it is a game that I found a little bit more addictive than Pong. Like, it is simply a more, I guess, vibrant, more fun, definitely more colorful version of the same core idea. Closest equivalent that I can really think of off the top of my head in terms of a similar game with very similar structure is one of the mini games featured in Wii Sports. That being the mini game that has the player hitting the tennis ball into various different targets against a wall, again, which would be another variation on tennis, the same way that Breakout is another variation on Pong, which itself is a virtual representation of the game table tennis, at least at its core, most basic idea. The collection that I played this version of Breakout on also includes a reimagined version of Breakout known as Neo Breakout. Neo Breakout is essentially closer to actually what I used to play on my phone, and I actually think is a more fun representation of all the various variations that you can do with this kind of very simplistic game. I think that there is actually a very interesting parallel between the games of Breakout and, let's say, something like Tetris, where Tetris has the player trying to get as many of the various shapes into various different rows to try to destroy specific lines of the various different shapes that are tetraminos that are falling down in the field of play. Whereas Breakout, you're attempting to use a paddle to launch a ball back up at these blocks to break the blocks and try to get them all broken down as quickly and as efficiently as you can. And that is effectively the difference between the two games. But yet there is some interesting parallels, and also just the way that the field of play is actually designed between the two games is somewhat similar. Although, again, the difference in the games is one is a puzzle game and one is a more of a, I guess, more action-oriented game in which the player is actively trying to do specific things in order to achieve their goal. Now, with Neo Breakout, one of the things that I really noticed that was very fun was how the game did have those features, like I said, that the version of the clone of the game that I had played on my phone had, that being that multiple balls would be in play at the same time. One of the things that I actually found more forgiving about this particular version of Breakout is the fact that the paddle that you're in control of is just that much bigger. Just those extra little bits of pixel space that it's bigger are way more convenient for the player to be able to actively hit the ball, and instead of having some of the hardships that I had with some of the other versions. One of the other things I very much liked about this particular version of Breakout is how the ball was able to bounce up behind the blocks up above, and it would constantly bounce up and down and try to knock as many of them down, which again is something that some of the other more modern Breakout clones that I've seen have done. And it's one thing that I noticed that the original game really didn't do. As soon as it would hit a block, it would immediately start bouncing back down. Whereas with games like Block Breaker, like I played on my phone, and games like Breakout Neo, it would just basically work the way that I was a little bit more familiar with. All that in mind, I think Breakout is actually a very fun game, and one that I do very much recommend that people can go back and experience, especially in a collection like this. I don't necessarily know how much I could recommend a game like Breakout or like Pong to people to be able just to purchase on their own and try to experience it. Obviously, there's also the arcade systems, which one of the things that I didn't mention yet is the fact that part of the reason why I may have had some of the issues controlling the paddle with this particular version of Breakout is the fact that I'm using a joystick on my Pro Controller for my Switch 2 instead of actively using one of the spinners that you traditionally would have found on an arcade unit for some of these games. And this is an issue that you have sometimes when translating old arcade games to a modern video game console, is the control scheme doesn't necessarily always translate one-to-one, and there may be some fine-tuning that may be difficult to achieve on some of these various different consoles, especially more modern consoles who just have controllers that are designed for very different games, and it wouldn't make a ton of sense for them to have controllers that they could sell for just one specific release or two specific releases, especially when it's games like Pong or like Breakout. And there are other devices that if you really want to experience what those spinner-style controllers could have been like, you could buy one of the newer Atari clone consoles and get some of their new spinner controllers that they have for those and use those to have a similar experience to playing some of these games in the way that they were intended to be played in an arcade on the arcade machines. With all of that in mind, I'm very curious to see what other people might have to say about Breakout. I know personally for me, I think Breakout is a much more fun game than Pong. I know I didn't necessarily talk as much about it as I did with Pong, but I do think that Breakout is just, personally for me, it's a more fun game because I am someone who plays primarily by myself. And so being able to play Breakout by myself is just a much more enjoyable experience than trying to play Pong by myself. Again, the analogy of it is that Breakout is basically something that I think anybody can play with a friend or just by themselves. Pong, you really need somebody else there to play it to really get the full experience of playing Pong. Again, without really going into too many details, I think that trying to play Pong by oneself is essentially akin to trying to play chess or checkers by yourself. You can do it. It's just kind of weird and not very much fun, and you're going to end up kind of being like the old guy in the Pixar short. Both versions of Breakout are playable in the Atari 50th Anniversary Celebration Expanded Edition, which I played on my Switch 2, similar to how I was able to play Pong in the same collection of games. The game, like I said, features various different timelines and tons of different old school arcade Atari games, and also some of their home console releases, and some of the Atari releases from third-party games like Namco on some of the Atari systems and some of the Atari hardware that they had. And so it is very interesting to sort of see and experience it. I do very much, like I said, with Pong, like in the Pong video, I very much recommend this particular software because I think it's worth it. It's available on multiple platforms, and there's just a lot of fun to really have and just to be able to experience some of these really early experiences. One of the things that I think for me really stands out with retro gaming is I actually think there's almost two categories now of retro gaming. You have what everybody really considers to be retro, right? Stuff like Pong and Breakout and the original NES and Super Nintendo games, stuff from the 2600 and the 7800 and the Sega Genesis and the Master System and the Game Boy. Those are very much retro things. And I also think there's another category with that too, which is I would say that there's almost more modern retro stuff as well. Stuff like on the PlayStation 2 that younger generations might consider retro, and I like to kind of consider it almost modern retro or newer retro or whatever you might want to call it, right? But regardless, at the end of the day, I'm very curious to see what you guys think about Breakout and what your thoughts on Breakout are. I'd be very, very happy if you guys commented on maybe an experience you had or just a fun thing that you may have had playing Breakout or some kind of Breakout clone on your cell phone or something. And hey, if you want to, please like the video and subscribe and maybe even give me some feedback on it. And if you guys watched all the way through, thank you for watching.